All right, welcome everybody. This is going to be the politics in the Gilded Age. I am recording this during conference periods, so there is no telling what kind of noise you'll hear, like particularly with my son coming in here at the moment. But I'm going to keep muscling through because I don't want to do 4 different parts like I did before. I'm going to talk about politics in the Gilded Age and explain the problems faced in politics and the political efforts towards reform. This exists alongside of the political machine issue and the party bosses, the Boss Tweed, Tammany Hall issues that I talked about in urbanization. That is certainly a component of the overall politics and industrialization, but it is not the only aspect of it. You're going to see that this is going to focus more on the national level. The citywide politics, the city political machines that focus the political power on these party bosses and the immigrant neighborhoods and this kind of corruption and graft, that does filter its way up to the national level. So there is that connection there. And it's going to be at the local level that the middle class is going to push back and say, no, we want to control the cities where we live. But that's going to eventually begin to filter out to the national politics. So it's important to understand how those things work. First off, at the national level, let's go back in time a little bit to the Reconstruction politics. Grant and the Republicans had been in control, but the redeeming Democrats, the Democrats who began to gain power in the 1870s, they threatened some control. So this is a big source of why the 15th Amendment gets passed, trying to protect black votes for Republicans. Unfortunately, Grant is not a strong president. There's lots of corruption in his administration with a thing called the whiskey ring. These are known as drinking buddies that manage to make a lot of money off the railroads that I've already kind of referred to. We call that cronyism, where he brings his friends along with him, and the patronage system that rewards people in the Republican Party with small government jobs. So basically, if you had worked for the Republicans and helped get out the vote, you would get some small job at the national level to be a postmaster or, some, secretary of the secretary to, the chairman of something or another. So you have that happening. We're going to have the credit mobilier scandal. That is related to railroads as well. That's early in the 1870s. And this is going to be followed by the Panic of 1873, which, if you remember me talking about the railway strike in 1877, that's kind of the trigger for the future railway strike. Grant will weaken the presidency. Lincoln had strengthened it to unprecedented levels. And of course, Johnson is kind of an anomaly because it was after Lincoln was assassinated and he was such an idiot. So there's really a great deal of hope when Grant comes into office that he's going to use the presidency in a really viable way. But what we see is that he doesn't. He's not a good president. He's not a good politician. If you remember from the Reconstruction documents, he talks about how they need to protect black votes and they need to maintain peace, but he really is not capable of effectively doing any of that. During this Gilded Age period, the Republicans are the primary party in power. But the party is split between 2 different groups. The radical Republicans, that are also called the stalwarts, that control Reconstruction but rely heavily on the use of patronage. They give their best friends the jobs. They're the ones that we call them bloody shirt Republicans. They're always talking about the Civil War and what the Southerners did and the Democrats and slaves and, all this kind of stuff. They're big into the economy. They're big into using the national government with the land grant system, and so they're not really as pure laissez-faire as you would think, right? They're all about the government having influence to help the economy, and they're all about using the government to control Reconstruction. So they're those kind of Republicans. And then you're going to have another group that emerges the closer into the more into the 1870s that we get, called the Reformers, also called the half-breeds or the mugwumps.
Half-bloods.
Not half-bloods, half-breeds.
Mudbloods is what they're called in Harry Potter. That's right.
Yes, Harry Potter reference. They oppose patronage. They want to move past the Civil War. These are the ones that talk a lot about laissez-faire. And that the government needs to have kind of this moderated regulation, but we don't want too much regulation. And so this is kind of the party where this idea about how can we use the government in effective ways, as opposed to the radical approach which is use the government in favor of business. We've already talked about the Compromise of 1877, so I'm not going to talk about that too much, except to say that Hayes is a reformer. He is not, he's not a radical, and this is part of why he strikes this compromise. Is because he believes that we need to scale back the use of government and start using it in more effective ways, more reforming ways, and less like a hammer to beat down the South. And so this is part of how he gets into office. And with him, there is no clear vision for the country. And you really have kind of this drive, and I've talked about this before, the profit motive of industrialization, that really means one party is no different from the other. This leads to deep social divisions and social problems. And so people the immigrants, the poor, blacks, they often get ignored in the first part of the Gilded Age because, well, they're others, and we don't really know what to do with them. And the reformers are not sure that using the government too heavily is a good thing. And so there's lots of kind of cautious approach. And so from 1877 to 1897, no single party is really in control. And so because you're going to have a president that tends to be Republican, a Senate that's going to tend to be dominated by Republicans, but a House of Representatives that's going to be pretty much controlled by the Democrats, or at least stalemated by the Democrats. Both will engage in this kind of Civil War memory, that the dominance of Civil War veterans, which you kind of saw that if you're reading Larson and his whole conflict, that kind of becomes a thing. And so there's a lot of questions. Now, by the time you get to 1897, this awareness of the others, the immigrants, the poor, they're going to start paying attention to the social problems, the poverty, the lack of education, the child labor. But remember what I said about the role of the strikes and the labor unions calling attention to those things. Things like the Haymarket riot in 1886 that begin to make people sit up and go, okay, wait a minute, maybe we're not taking care of the most vulnerable people. And so I think that's a real valid concern. Elections, party loyalty is a big deal. And certainly party loyalty is a part of the political machine where they buy votes, and I'm going to tell you to vote Republican, and you're going to vote for any Republican because that's what I'm telling you to do. You have high voter turnout, but that's because they're all white males. We have a very limited electorate, limited suffrage, even though the suffrage among white males is widespread, but that far from includes the majority of Americans. New York and Ohio are the major swing states of the period, as opposed to, say, Texas and California now. And this is what we call the anonymous presidents, the presidents we never remember. I mean, if you were to ask me some random, trivia question about some president from, the 1890s, I'm going to have to think pretty hard about it and go through like a bunch of different mental hoops to figure out which one it is, because there's a lot of people that don't know these presidents. The big story of the politics of this period is the impact of third parties and special interest groups, the Populist Party and, of course, the Progressives. And as I mentioned earlier, reform movements are going to start at the local and the state level, with the middle class trying to take power back from the political machines. The Republicans are kind of known as the party of morality, big business, union veterans, so they're the ones that love America, the grand old party. They were the ones that supported abolition and temperance prior to the Civil War. These are the ones that support temperance now. Of course, remember, the reformers take over, and they're less concerned with, the others, and they're the blacks and the poor, and they're also have some concerns about the use of government as we saw it during Reconstruction. The Republicans are largely Protestant. Why do I point this out? Well, that's because it helps you understand who makes up the Democratic Party. Strong in the South, because, the Democrats back from before the Civil War, they don't like federal government control. This is part of why we see the reforming Republicans beginning to embrace kind of restricted government issues. They're also going to have lots of support in the big cities because they don't tell people that they can't drink, and they don't kind of look down their nose at Catholics. What you're going to see is they're supported by immigrants that tend to be Catholic. The Democrats tend to be more sensitive to working issues, even though they are dominated by the Southern kind of agricultural system. So this will take us to the balance of power, with the presidents winning the presidency more often. The exception of that's going to be Grover Cleveland, who wins twice on non-consecutive occasions. And keep in mind that it's the party boss of the Gilded Age that's dominant in politics, not the president. So we don't have a Lincoln that's really controlling things. Rather, we have Marcus Hanna, who controls the Republican Party. And you're thinking, who's Marcus Hanna? That's because very few people know who Marcus Hanna is. But he was the guy that controlled the Republican Party, particularly from Ohio. Despite the split in the Republican Party, they win in 1880. James Garfield, he's a reformer. He's against the patronage system. He promotes, we're going to get rid of patronage and cronyism and clean up politics and get rid of the corruption, trying to appeal to those middle-class voters. He gets assassinated by this crazy guy who thought that because he distributed some pamphlets or because he liked Garfield that he should get a job, right? The guy is clearly mentally unstable, so kind of one of those random acts of violence that kills Garfield. And the American public says, oh my goodness, another president killed, how terrible. Chester Arthur replaces him. Chester Arthur is kind of he's a joke as far as the president's concerned. The big thing, his big contribution, if you think back to the Dawes Allotment Act that I talked about with the Native Americans, he signs that piece of legislation. So go Garfield, yeah, way to treat the Native Americans. And he will also sign the Pendleton Act, which is a civil service reform act. And what that's meant to do is take a number of the jobs out of kind of this patronage system and say there's certain jobs that should be filled by experts and people that know what they're doing, people that are good at accounting or good at managing, businesses, as opposed to, which political party did you support? And, you're the cousin of the nephew of the friend of so-and-so. And, so they start pushing to have certain government jobs based on expertise, and they start having a civil service test and all that kind of stuff. So it's an early attempt to kind of take politics out of government functions. And this is not a terrible idea, really, that it's based on merit and that you can't be removed for random political reasons. Now, make no mistake, this doesn't mean that every time you have a new president that he doesn't bring new cabinet members in and those cabinet members bring new people in. So you still have a degree of that even today. But I'm talking about your ordinary functionary jobs where it really helps to have somebody that knows what they're doing, somebody who's good at managing accounts or good at managing the Parks and Rec department, for instance. Those jobs are immune to a great extent from the whims of the voting populace. And this is really kind of the beginning of what we call progressive ideas about science and expertise, and that we should be relying on expertise to make decisions about how government functions, as opposed to just emotion or who gives the most money. Makes you wonder if we could learn some lessons from that now. 1884, because Chester Arthur is, kind of an awful president. Even though he signs the Pendleton Act and people think, oh, well, this is great, people don't like Chester Arthur. And the Republicans are still very tainted by corruption. They haven't cleaned house enough. And so Grover Cleveland comes in opposing Tammany Hall, opposing Boss Tweed, and he starts attracting Republican reformers, talking about cleaning up government. And he's not a Democrat in the sense of a Southern Democrat. He's a Democrat in the sense of he believes we should take care of workers and that kind of thing. And keep in mind, this is 1884. So this is after we've had some unionization and unions are beginning to be kind of powerful and that kind of thing. So because this is before the Haymarket riot. So this is before the Knights of Labor has really collapsed. So he keeps a lot of immigrant support, and then he brings on board these kind of reformer middle-class Republicans. And the Republican candidate was clearly tainted. And so we continue to have issues. Even though Grover Cleveland is a Democrat, he still struggles with unions and, of course, the 1886 Haymarket riot. And the economy also tanks. This creates some problems. And you start seeing in the 1880s resentment towards the corporations. Frustration with the rebate system and how it's hurting small business and farmers, and that it's unfair for customers and it's not really fair and equal. And so there starts to be a lot of pressure among both Democrats and Republicans to change the system. And how do we focus on fairness and justice towards workers? This question of, don't they have a right? If so, they don't own they don't own property, they don't own the factory, but they own their labor, and so should they have some protections for that? And so this is a process. It doesn't happen all in Grover Cleveland's administration. It doesn't happen all in 1886, but it's kind of a trend that we see in the 1880s as Grover Cleveland's president and even after he's president. One of the other big problems that we see is going to be gold and silver. During the Civil War, Lincoln had relied on greenbacks, which is paper money. It's kind of like a variation of a government bond, where the government guarantees this paper money as a valid exchange rate, and it's not really backed by gold and silver. Farmers tend to like greenbacks or money that's kind of inflated. And you would think, why? That's going to raise prices, right? Well, it does raise prices, but what that means is that they get more money for what they sell. It also means that when they pay back loans, their money is a little more powerful because it's worth more, because it's inflated, right? I know this is a crazy concept. It gets confusing. I always have to stop and think my way through it. So when you get to economics and you talk about this, just understand it is confusing. So you have farmers liking inflated prices. Bankers don't like it, though, because they want their money to be worth what it's supposed to be worth, right? They want to know when somebody pays back $1 of debt, they're getting a full dollar, not 98 cents. And because that 98 cents multiplied over $1,000 loan is going to be a nice little chunk of change. So you have in 1879 Congress moving to the gold standard. And this is part of, working on the Civil War debt, trying to create a stable economy, maybe a little bit of an aftershock from the Panic of 1873. And so the gold standard becomes the standard for the United States until the 1930s, when FDR takes us off the gold standard as a response to the Great Depression. The gold standard is rigid and fixed. It means that $1 is worth $1 in gold. End of story. And so it doesn't allow you to buy on debt, especially as a country or as a bank. So it does create a stable economy, which bankers and businesses like, but it makes it very difficult for people to expand their businesses. It makes it difficult for farmers to borrow money against next year's crop. And so in some ways, it makes the economy much less likely to grow, even though it does create stability. One thing we do see is the rise of silver. The silver strikes in the 1880s mean that people are going, oh, well, if we can't, if gold is a problem and we don't like paper money, let's do silver. And you do see that the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 does start using silver as a backing for some currency. Of course, all of this is weighed against the gold standard as well. And so we have this issue, this back and forth, and eventually Congress will go off the silver standard, and they'll stop buying silver. What this shows us is that there's this huge question about money supply and how the government can influence the money supply. And it doesn't really get resolved until you get to a little bit. It gets resolved with the creation of the Federal Reserve System under Woodrow Wilson, and this happens in 1914. I have to Google the date to be sure, but it's 1914-ish. And he creates the Federal Reserve to kind of manage interest rates and exchange rates and that kind of thing. That's the first attempt. And then the next attempt is when FDR comes in and he kills off the gold standard, like most developed countries had done by the 1930s, to allow countries the flexibility to borrow money with bonds and that kind of thing, so that they can loan money out and stimulate economic growth by letting businesses expand or farmers cover their losses or whatever. So just kind of keep in mind that this gold and silver issue sits in the background of politics. It'll be particularly powerful in the 1890s with William Jennings Bryant and the Democrats. We have gold bugs and silverites and that kind of thing. If you're a fan of Wizard of Oz, that has a kind of a background of the gold and silver issue. Interstate Commerce Commission, Grover Cleveland ends up, you have this court case where the Supreme Court says that states cannot influence interstate commerce, that that's the purview of Congress. So if you have a railroad that runs from one end of Illinois to the other, within that state, the state can control that, but they can't control rates if it crosses state lines. So for these huge transcontinental railroads, or these railroads that go across multiple states, Congress is the one who sets the rates, that the states can't negotiate special deals. And so public pressure starts to say, well, you know what, we need to have a commission that kind of monitors railroad rates and make sure that those things don't get out of hand. And so he creates the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887. Keep in mind, Grover Cleveland, you know, he wins in, 84, and he goes out of office in 88, and then from 88 to 92, I think he wins again in 92. So this is at the end of his first term. He creates this Interstate Commerce Commission as a response to that, but it's not really, doesn't have a whole lot of power. The tariff issue is going to be another problem. Democrats want to cut the tariffs because they represent the South, right? And they want to help agricultural prices. And they think that low tariffs will mean there's more markets for American agricultural goods. But businesses and factories want to keep tariffs high so they can preserve the markets within the United States. And so you've got this conflict with the tariffs that we saw emerging prior to the Civil War between the agricultural sector and the factory sector. And so tariffs continue to simmer as an issue. Republicans who are pro-manufacturing, they tend to favor the tariffs. And so because they tend to dominate this period, tariffs typically stay fairly high, but this creates a great deal of resentment among farmers and agricultural sectors. And the tariff issue won't eventually go away until we pass the income tax. Income tax that's passed in 1916 with the 16th Amendment, because if you pay your taxes on the 16th, they're late. But when they pass the income tax amendment, that's what allows us to stop focusing on tariffs as the sole means to fund the government. So that's actually the purpose of income tax, and it's very ironic that nowadays we argue about taxes all the time, when really that was meant to stop the political stalemates that what we saw happening in the Gilded Age. So, you know, the more things change, the more things stay the same. So now we don't argue about tariffs so much, but we argue about taxes. And the whole issue of tariffs that the Democrats say is that, well, you know, if we believe in laissez-faire, then, you know, we should be okay with, you know, competition and letting people, you know, companies compete. Why are we giving them special protections? And so you have this division there in Congress, and nothing gets done, and it leaves farmers feeling pretty upset. And industrial workers, I mean, if there's not enough competition, that makes them vulnerable, you know, as far as their jobs, either, you know, if the industry goes under or there's not enough places to work, all that kind of stuff. So in 1888, the industry sector wins. Republican Harrison, he takes over to protect the tariffs. And Cleveland, of course, was kind of a victim of a small panic, and so people were upset about the money. Harrison manages to win in the Electoral College, not over the popular vote. So he wins the right states, so to speak. And we see that there is an attempt with the McKinley tariff to kind of help things with the agricultural sector. And we see in 1888 they cut the taxes on sugar, but they raise tariffs on textiles. This is going to matter when we get to imperialism and we look at American presence in Cuba. Because America starts to get very interested in Cuba as a sugar producer. And so that's going to trigger, this McKinley tariff is going to trigger some of that, which will eventually lead to us being involved in the Spanish-American War. So the public will begin to blame industrialization for social problems and ask the government to fix it. So it's into 1890 that you see the Republican Harrison begin to bend to public will, and Congress bend to public will to pass the Sherman Antitrust Act. You must know the Sherman Antitrust Act. There's lots of times that this kind of legislation pops up as being relevant. And I can tell you, as somebody that looks at document-based questions and that looks at standardized tests, that this question of the use of the Sherman Antitrust Act that was meant to declare illegal any combination in the form of a trust or a conspiracy that restrains trade or commerce among the states. And so this was meant to limit the great big monopolies. However, there's no kind of enforcement arm to this. And really what ends up happening is they start applying it to unions, saying that they're restraining competition. It's not until you start to have a really strong president that's not afraid of upsetting, wealthy donors, that you really see the Sherman Antitrust Act used in any kind of significant way. But this is the legislation, and it does have that language in there that recognizes that restraining competition by buying out your competitors is not fair. It's not really the American way. It's not good for consumers. It's not good for workers. So this kind of concept is starting to emerge of not only progressive, we want experts in charge, but also we need to ensure fairness and justice. And those are progressive ideas that start to gain traction in the 1890s. So all of this week, action and inaction in relation to railroad rates, the Interstate Commerce Commission and its failure to act, in relation to the Sherman Antitrust Act and its application to the unions, is going to cause farmers to begin to say, hey, if companies can pool their resources and if workers can pool their resources, why can't we? And so you're going to see the emergence of populism. This cartoon right here is a classic one. I think this is a picture of Cleveland up here. This is Democrat. This is Republican. You can see the Republican Party's missing some tail feathers. That's between, first off, kind of the similarity with Cleveland, but then also the fact that the Republicans have clearly lost some tail feathers, I think is indicative of a Democrat victory. So you can kind of see from this, though, that both parties are about equal. That no one party is significantly stronger than the other, and I think that's kind of interesting. And I can't tell, this one has a tag to it, but I can't tell what that is. I wonder if it says Liberty, maybe? I can't tell. Something like that. Anyways, so that's kind of an interesting cartoon. Big business had invaded the farm. And I talked about this when we talked about consolidation and farmers. It becomes difficult for small homesteads to make it. So the farms that are going to be successful are the ones that had significant resources when they started, are the farms that get sold out to corporations with foreign investors. And so this idea of the small homesteader becomes less and less powerful, especially by the time you get to the 1890s. Farmers are very frustrated. And this all has to do with railroads and tariffs, banks holding mortgages because you have to go borrow money to, plant for that year, and it's all based on if agricultural prices stay stable, which they often didn't. This doesn't factor in natural disasters, drought, blizzards, grasshoppers, those kinds of things that are prevalent on the Great Plains. And so really it's very hard for farmers to make a profit. So the only farms that are really viable are the ones that have the resources to invest in technology, to be more efficient, the ones that have, big investment dollars where they can sustain a bad year or two. And then, of course, the ones that can negotiate the best transportation rates to get their goods to market, or have the best loan interest rates. And so this is where we see farmers getting extremely frustrated. Just some pictures of farms to kind of give you an idea. The problem with deflated money. If greenbacks and paper money and silver money leads to inflation, the gold standard leads to deflation. Deflation is not necessarily evil in and of itself. What deflation means is that a dollar is worth a dollar. I take my dollar and I buy a dollar's worth of goods. It's not inflated. Think in terms of gas prices, right? Gas prices today, they used to be very overinflated, right? We were paying, $3.50, $4 a gallon, which is probably way more than what it should have been. Because, certainly the price of, say, $1.89 or $1.70 a gallon is too cheap, right? That's not going to cover the cost of refining and transportation and all that kind of stuff. So that is going to be a deflated price at $1.70. An inflated price is going to be $4 a gallon. An inflated price means that you're paying more money for the product, and really fundamentally the value of it is, and I'm just going to kind of speak randomly because I'm not an oil and gas expert, but I would imagine that probably the actual value of a gallon of gas is probably somewhere around $2.50. So if we were paying $2.50 a gallon for gas, we're probably basically covering the cost of extracting it, refining it, getting it to the gas stations, paying salaries, there may not be a whole lot of profit margin there, but that's probably covers your cost. So if it's less than a certain amount, it's not covering the cost. If it's more than that, it's inflated. So here's the problem with deflated money. I borrow money for seed and tools, okay? And this is especially true if I'm having to keep a budget account with a landowner because I'm a sharecropper. So I borrow money for that, and essentially I pay that money back based on the agricultural prices. Well, if I borrow money and it's inflated, or I'm sorry, if I borrow money and like $1's worth $1, okay, and then I pay it back, and $1 is really only worth 90 cents, but I'm still giving you $1, right? Now it only buys 90 cents worth of stuff, but I'm paying back the $1, even though the $1 I borrowed 12 months ago bought $1's worth of stuff. Okay, the problem with inflation is, and I may have that backwards, inflation changes it, because then $1 is too strong, right? And so if I borrow at inflated rates, I'm borrowing $1 that's going to cost me more money to borrow. I explained that terribly, but you kind of get the general gist of it. So anyways, we see that, I'm trying to check the time here. We see that that farmers get upset because they are making less money with the deflated rates. And they believe that it's the Eastern banks pressuring Congress, and so they feel like their voices aren't being heard. And so this is when they start to create organizations. The first one is the Grange, 1866 to roughly 1877. Actually, the Grange exists a little bit after that, but it's largely kind of a social organization. It was a national farm organization to promote education, but also to form cooperatives to make agricultural products more marketable, to limit competition between farmers, kind of create kind of a monopoly, so to speak, and negotiate better shipping rates. Now, the Grange is largely unsuccessful, and especially once the Wabash v. Illinois comes in and you have the Interstate Commerce Act, this kind of creates some problems for the Grange. So the Grange is not very strong, and it becomes, it kind of collapses under that pressure. This is a kind of a drawing, the gift for the Grangers, showing all these kind of happy farm, these bucolic, that's what happy farm means. And the Grange is really replaced politically as a political organization by the Farmers Alliance from 1877 to roughly the 1890s, depending on which state you're talking about. And that is actually founded in Texas, and it's meant to be a stronger organization for farmers. And it grows to the Great Plains region and into the West. They have a Colored Farmers Alliance to kind of help with the sharecroppers, although the KKK is pretty tough on them. And they organize these exchanges, which instead of having a small local cooperative where we take, say, a county and we negotiate, we all kind of agree what price we're going to negotiate at. They take this concept and they apply it to the entire state. So if I belong for the Texas Exchange, the Texas Exchange helps negotiate shipping rates, and that helps stabilize everybody's price within Texas. However, they also get involved in the loan-making business, too, to offer low-interest loans. And they make too many loans, they're not profitable, and they face a lot of pressure because people perceive them as being an antitrust organization, being a trust organization. And so by 1890, you have Western states getting much more politically active, deciding that if we're really going to change things, what we need to do is focus on national politics. And so they create the People's Party, which is also known as the Populists. And they're fairly small at first, and it will begin to have the most power in the Western states. The Southern, they're kind of open to blacks and whites. So the South is a little more unsure because they're not sure they want to be in a political party with black people. And so they have a slight preference for the Democrats. So when the Democrats start adopting some of the ideas of the populists and start talking kind of the same way, you'll see that most of the Southerners end up staying with the Democrats, which is part of why the populists never get very strong. In fact, some people can argue that some of the voting restrictions about poll taxes and reading requirements are a direct result of the Populist Party, their appeal to the black vote, and that the Southern Democrats wanted to be sure the populists didn't get a hold of Southern electoral votes. And so that could be an actual valid point there. The big idea with the populace is going to be this, and the Farmers Alliance, is going to be the sub-treasury plan, which is that the government buys surplus crops at a set price, they hold on to it, and that the government can weather the storms of the agricultural market better than farmers can. So that farmers basically have a set customer. And that the government will then release crops as it's necessary, and they will absorb the economic shocks. And I put on here that they're an ag broker. The interesting part is that we still kind of have that system now. Not quite exactly the way the populace created it, but we still have government subsidies. Now, those really come into play in the 1930s as a response to the Great Depression. But this is where kind of this idea starts. And so I think it's really fascinating. A lot of the key ideas that the Populist Party has ends up getting adopted in the Progressive era and certainly during the New Deal. And so you get to 1890 and you're going to have the sub-treasury plan, coinage of silver, end to tariffs and replaced with an income tax, end to national banks, have small state banks, because you didn't have one single national bank, but you began to have these large banking companies as opposed to these small individual state banks. They want increased railroad regulation. There we go. And they want direct election of senators because they want to break the power of the political machine, because the political machine filtered in these immigrant votes, these voters that would like sell their votes in exchange for services, and then so you get people elected, and then you would have big businesses and big banks bankroll, national candidates, and so their idea is that this is sending the wrong people to the Senate. Back before the direct election of senators, which is the 17th Amendment, what you had were state legislatures that sent their senators in. You would have a state election, and the senators would nominate who they wanted to go to the Senate, and that person would go in, and he basically owed his position to the state legislature. He owed his position to that kind of state political machine. And so by trying to break that, they're trying to make sure that everyone gets a say in who their senators are, to make the Senate more accountable to the people and less accountable to the party machine. And you do see them having some success in Minnesota, South Dakota, some of the states. They have some legislators that go to the Senate. And you'll see that this is part of what drives the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, the Republicans trying to make the populists happy and loosening up some of the money. Southern Democrats will start to embrace some of these demands. And then we'll see that by 1892, a lot of that, the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and the Southern Democrats talking about farmer concerns tends to pass away. And you're going to see that the populists by 1892 will really talk about having their own presidential candidate. And they will say that we're going to adopt worker concerns, we're going to embrace unions, we're going to talk about, cutting back working hours, having an 8-hour workday, we're going to talk about, worker safety, we're going to talk about the graduated income tax. We believe that the powers of the government should be expanded as rapidly and as far as the good sense of an intelligent people and the teachings of experience shall justify. So this is when they start becoming a national party. However, Cleveland runs for the Democrats again, and the Democrats managed to get control in 1892. And while the populists gain some seats in Congress, they don't gain enough to be super relevant. Kind of think Tea Party today. And the industrial workers are not sure that the populists can be trusted. And of course, all of this follows the Knights of Labor and the Haymarket Riot and the emergence of the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, who was far less politically active, more focused on negotiations and that kind of stuff. So the big cities remain Democratic, and the populists are very nativist, and so the immigrant workers don't really want to embrace the Populist Party. And then you've got the issue of race in the South, all of this kind of weakening the populist platform. You have the Panic of 1893 after, Grover Cleveland becomes the president. And you had, rapid railroad expansion. That's going to create some problems. We have a depression with 18% unemployment. And there's no government in play, right? We don't have these government systems really that are strong and active to take care of people. And in fact, one could argue that the rise of progressivism is because of the Panic of 1893 and the extreme poverty and the conditions that panic creates. And people start saying, hey, we need to be more socially concerned. So we see that they repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in an attempt to stabilize the economy. In reality, all that does is make the Depression worse because it contracts the economy, puts less money out there. And it's into this that you're going to have the gold bugs and the silverites and William Jennings Bryan emerging as a candidate in 1896, where he starts to embrace the silver issue, kind of drags the Democrats into kind of the silver thing. And so you've got this panic that kind of shapes politics in the late 1890s. FYI, there's no mistaking that imperialism begins in 1898. And the question that you can kind of simmer in the back of your head as we finish up talking about politics of the Gilded Age is, to what extent did economic pressures lead to this kind of concern about, we need to find new markets, we need to find new resources, we need to be expanding, and that staying within our own boundaries is not expanding enough. You have the gold bug silverite issue, and I'm not going to dwell too much on that. Just know that William Jennings Bryan becomes the Democratic candidate. He embraces the silver issue. He embraces this kind of hybrid of the Populist Party and the Democrats. And this is kind of what causes the Populists to lose political relevance, because Bryan kind of adopts a lot of that. This is William Jennings Bryan. He's going to be around for a few years. He runs for president like 3 different times: 1896, 1900, does he run in 04? I don't think he does run in 04. I know he runs in 1908, I'm pretty sure. So he runs several different times. He's also the guy that when we get to the 1920s and we talk about the emergence of fundamentalism and the evolution versus creationism debate as an example of fundamentalism, he's the guy that argues for fundamentalism and for, that we should outlaw teaching evolution and science in the classroom. But that's when he's older. You can see here he's got this cross. His famous speech was called the Cross of Gold, and how the Cross of Gold was, destroying our country and all that kind of stuff. And so you see him kind of overturning the chairs of the Silver Party, the Democratic Party, the Populist Party. And he's this great speaker. He's called the Boy Orator. He is definitely an impassioned speaker, definitely has a kind of evangelical sort of way of speaking, some of which turns immigrant voters off because they feel, especially if you're a Catholic immigrant, this kind of evangelical approach seems a little bit overdone. And so he kind of fails to connect with people. And the Republicans will then trot out William McKinley in 1896. And McKinley is more of a moderate Republican. And he argues that we need to take care of the workers, we need to protect them, but we want to encourage business growth, and all this kind of stuff. And he has a very successful advertising campaign. It also helps that, Grover Cleveland was a Democrat, and the Democrats were in charge when the Panic of 1893 happened. So in 1896, everybody kind of embraces the Republicans again, and William Jennings Bryan wins pretty handily. And it's William McKinley that's going to kind of usher in the age of imperialism in a lot of different ways. He's the last kind of standard Republican president. When he is assassinated in 1901, he will be replaced by Teddy Roosevelt, who will come in and he'll be this strong progressive reformer. You still have within the Republican Party going into 1896 and even 1900 kind of this little bit of a division between these very reform-minded, we need to use the government in careful ways, and then people that are very pro-business, very cautious kind of approach. And so the Republican Party continues to have kind of this duality to it, and that's how Teddy Roosevelt becomes the vice presidential candidate in 1900, is trying to appeal to that element of the Republican Party to keep, votes from being split up. Part of the decline of populism and part of Bryan's loss is that there were gold strikes in Canada and Alaska and South Africa, which makes gold more readily available. And so this kind of loosens the money supply a little bit. And so we have this full gold standard currency. There's no longer any kind of silver involved. And so the populace will die out, but their reforms will not. We'll see by the time we get to the progressive era, and especially to the New Deal, we'll see the income tax as an answer to tariffs. We'll see the direct election of senators as an answer to corruption. We're going to see secret ballots so that now, people can't see who you vote for, that your employer can't judge you by who you vote. We're going to see primaries where, again, trying to break the power of the political machine, where candidates have to run to become a candidate. We have the system now. If you want to, that's why all the stuff about the 2016 election, we've got all these Republican candidates that want to vie for the primary to be the presidential candidate for the Republican Party so they can then run in the election. This is a result of populism and this awareness of the political party machine that funneled money and traded services for votes was sometimes not very democratic. And so the progressives will grasp the idea of the populace and applying political pressure. This is why the Republican Party especially develops a very vibrant progressive wing that puts a lot of political pressure to get reforms passed. So we see that kind of happening. We also see that I lost my train of thought. Sorry. So McKinley comes in, and the economy is starting to recover a little bit from the Panic of 1893. McKinley has this very moderate pro-business course. Like I said, he's really the last of your kind of traditional Republican presidents. And he has kind of this he supports tariffs, but he supports what we call reciprocity, where we have special deals with certain countries that allow some flexibility with the tariffs. He begins to, kind of side with labor a little bit, telling business owners, well, you should listen to the workers some, that if you don't want a bunch of unions and the pressures that they bring, you should listen. And so social problems will begin to kind of fade to the background somewhat as the economy calms down, as more people get jobs. And this is where imperialism will come in. And McKinley will start off not really trying to avoid imperialism, not being in favor of it, but the will of the country will really take over, and people will really want to get involved in the world. And so the next level, and of course into this you're going to have, McKinley going into 1898, we have the Spanish-American War, kind of the development of Teddy Roosevelt, and the strengthening of this reform wing of the Republican Party that will then kind of push Teddy Roosevelt into office, and where we really see the emergence of progressive reforms. And so I'm going to kind of pause with the political stuff there, because the next thing we'll talk about is imperialism. But I want to be sure and let you know about Jim Crow politics. Remember the role of sharecroppers, that they, landless farmers trade kind of buying, farming on the haves in exchange for having a place to live and having an occupation. And so you've got sharecropping being very prominent in the South with this and that whole system of, buying a furnish and that kind of thing. Then you're going to see some that do take advantage of the Homestead Act. The Colored Farmers Alliance, like I talked about earlier, they get a lot of pressure from the KKK trying to stop their votes. We're going to see that Democrats will respond to keep blacks out of the polling place. And so disfranchisement was meant to hurt populism and hurt black votes. So it wasn't just black votes they were trying to limit. The Populist Party provided an avenue for black voters to be politically active, and they showed they were willing to be. And so then you have these property requirements and the reading laws and all that kind of stuff really kind of entrenched into the political system. And these are the things that, if you've seen the movie Selma, that it takes until 1965 to tear down. The 15th Amendment protected the right to vote, but it doesn't tell the states how to control their voting rolls. So each state could make their own decisions. We see that now with some states having voter ID laws, where you have to have an ID card or a driver's license in order to vote, Texas being one of those. And of course, the gist of it is that that's not that. The question is that really a poll tax, making people go buy an ID card? Is that a poll tax, or is, the $16 for an ID card really that big a deal? And so these are some interesting questions that we can kind of, in a modern sense, we can still see how this works. But for the South, back in the Gilded Age, they placed the poll tax where you actually have to pay to vote, a literacy test where you have to read. Again, think back to the movie Selma. Where you have to own property. They have grandfather clauses to exempt white voters, where if your father voted in 1860 and okay, so you can't read, but your grandfather voted, so that means you get to vote now too. So you see that happening to kind of guarantee white power at the ballot box. Plessy v. Ferguson. So let's not confuse discrimination with Jim Crow. Discrimination had always been around in the North. And the North was not necessarily, just because they didn't like slavery didn't mean they thought blacks were equal. And so the North and the South are both discriminatory in jobs and housing and education. None of that is really any different. The difference is the South has a legalization of separate races, that blacks can only use this rail car and whites can only use that rail car. Blacks have to use this door, whites use that door. Blacks use this bathroom, whites use that bathroom. And the Supreme Court had actually, or the Congress had actually tried to fix that in 1875, but the Supreme Court overturns it. Says that really the Civil Rights Act only applies to the 14th Amendment, and they can't tell businesses who, how to run themselves. So that if you have Jim Crow segregation that a community, a city decides to put in place, and all the businesses agree to it, then who's the national government to tell them what to do? And so it's into this kind of environment. This should tell you a lot about the Supreme Court of the Gilded Age. So you have some people, black communities have not been completely idle. Remember, the populists have kind of engaged them a little bit politically. You have a very vibrant middle-class black community that's vibrant but small. That in communities like New Orleans and Atlanta are very frustrated by Jim Crow segregation. So they start to try to challenge it through the legal system. And so Plessy is a guy that he looks white. He's like an octoroon, right? He's one-eighth black. And so he sits in a white rail car. Nobody says anything to him. He's dressed nicely. He looks white. And then he announces to the railroad guy, hey, by the way, I'm black. So they arrest him. And so he works this all the way through court, refuses to pay the fine, refuses to change rail cars. And so this ends up working its way to the Supreme Court over this question of public transportation and public facilities. And can states separate them? And what the Supreme Court comes down and says is you can have them separate as long as they're equal. Okay, and that's all the 14th Amendment guarantees. As long as it's equal, that's all that matters. And so this becomes the legal foundation, Plessy v. Ferguson does, for segregation and discrimination in the South. And it's not until you have Brown v. Board that gets struck down, where the Supreme Court turns around and says, you know what, separate can never be equal. And if you think in terms of Frederick Douglass's comments, if you think in terms of the movie Selma, you can certainly see that this is very true and very powerful, that separate is not equal, that it has a perception of being inferior. But it takes 50 years for that to get fixed. This kind of is an artist's depiction of the Plessy case, although Plessy was much less African-looking. He was much less Afro-looking, I guess you could say. He didn't have dark skin. He was, just looked like an ordinary guy, really. In Jim Crow minstrel show, the term Jim Crow comes from entertainers that would dress in blackface and kind of act stupid and silly. The idea being that, hey, if you can, that if I'm kind of stupid, I can say all kinds of outrageous things. Think Larry the Cable Guy, right? Oh, Lord, I'm sorry. God bless the pygmies, right? And he says that stuff because he's just said something really outrageous and controversial, and yet he plays it off because he's dumb, right? Jeff Dunham does this with his puppets. He uses his puppets as an avenue to say something outrageous and controversial. So the Jim Crow minstrel shows often did that by depicting comedians and entertainers in blackface, saying, well, black people, they're silly, and, they're going to say all kinds of crazy stuff, and we can laugh at what they say. And so they would have commentary on society, on politics, on economics, and they would do it in blackface because it would allow them to get away with that. And so this is where kind of the name Jim Crow comes from. One of the responses to the emerging political activism of the Gilded Age through the Populist Party and through trying to really kind of claim, especially after the Compromise of 1877, claim their position politically, is going to be violence. The KKK will always have violence out there. Lynching is a big deal. Ida B. Wells covers a lot of this, where she examines the fact that lynching is often economically motivated, that while on the surface it may be because a black man didn't show proper respect, or because he threatened a white woman, which was always the kind of the deal with the KKK, we have to protect our women, right? What Ida Wells says is that in reality, these are communities that are being economically squeezed, and so they react against the most vulnerable members of their community, which in this case is the black community. And it's kind of a systematic way of removing any kind of leadership and leaving those communities kind of lost. And so this really kind of stays in effect. I mean, you see it, you'll have some periods where it gets worse than others. 1920s, 1930s, we have lynching. So don't think that it goes away just because we hit the 20th century. Lynching and that kind of racial violence stays around. One could even argue that perhaps the crimes with Ferguson and Eric Garner and the kid up in, Chicago or Illinois or wherever that was, that's a reflection of this as well. So here's Ida B. Wells. She's one of those kind of very politically active, middle-class, educated blacks that create all kinds of alliances and associations in response to that, trying to change things, trying to draw attention to the concerns of blacks. Booker T. Washington, 1895, the year before the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling, he gives a famous speech called the Atlanta Compromise, and gives it to a bunch of white people. And basically he says that, what the African American needs is economic opportunity, that this push for political rights and political activity, i.e. populists, is not what the black community needs. They need education, they need valid employment, and so he begins to urge for postponing civil rights. And white people really like this message. They're okay with blacks contributing to the economy. What they don't want is them controlling politics. And so Booker T. Washington becomes known as an accommodationist. And white leaders, white politicians really like him. Teddy Roosevelt will even invite him to have dinner in the White House. He'll catch a lot of flack for it. But certainly Booker T. Washington is seen as somebody that the white community would want to have working with them, as opposed to these politically active blacks. And so he's kind of this accommodationist. He is big on education. He starts the Tuskegee Institute to start as kind of a level of higher education. And really, because of his support among the white community, he becomes very dominant with black organizations. And and kind of the underside of Booker T. Washington is that he really kind of serves as a gatekeeper for which organizations get funds and which organizations don't from wealthy white donors. And so this creates some resentment within the black community. So just understand that Booker T. Washington is not kind of this monolithic, everybody loved him kind of person. There were some discrepancies in the black community, and we'll see this echoed a little bit when we get to Martin Luther King and, say, Malcolm X, and some of these questions about which leader truly represents the black community. So just kind of keep that in the back of your head, just to know that. W.E.B. Du Bois is another activist, scholar, sociologist, who argues that blacks were losing their civil rights, and the only thing that would protect them was civil rights. That the black community needed to focus on taking their most talented, most educated people, getting them back in the black community to educate and share that knowledge with other blacks, and that this will basically spread, kind of uplift the entire race. And he challenges this idea of accommodation. Du Bois says, no, we need to fight for our political rights. Think Frederick Douglass in that Reconstruction document that we read. That what blacks needed most was the right to vote and control their destiny, and that white people needed to just get out of their way. So this is kind of the difference between Du Bois and Washington. They do not like each other. Du Bois is a very harsh critic of Booker T. Washington. And what we'll see is that Du Bois and several other black activists who are frustrated with the accommodationist approach will then form the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This actually has a couple of different phases. 1906, they have the Niagara Falls Convention, and then in 1908, it becomes the NAACP. And it's meant to put political pressure. It's also meant to challenge things in the court system, to use the judicial branch to challenge laws, to actually use the checks and balances system to keep bad laws from being on the books. From 1908 until really about the 1930s, at World War II, the NAACP is really trying to figure out how to make all this work. It's not that they're completely ineffective, because they are effective in some ways, but they're not a strong, significant political organization until World War II. And a lot of this time from 1908 to the 1940s is spent learning how to work the legal system, how to work the checks and balances, how to work protests and marches and that kind of thing. So just know that this is the background for the NAACP. So this kind of gives you a snapshot of what the political branch looks like. When we get in class, we'll look at some different documents and talk some more about this. And you need to understand kind of this background to understand the influence of imperialism and how all of that works. And this also helps give you a context for how blacks function. And when we revisit really the black community, with the exception of kind of the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, where it's all very kind of cultural and artistic. When we come back to black political activity in around World War II, this will make more sense, right? You'll begin to see this as part of a process and not just kind of random isolated stuff. So I hope this was helpful. And again, this is a part of the overall Gilded Age, so be sure that you have listened to all three of the lectures: unions, urbanization, and politics. Thank you very much. And hey, it's only an hour and 1 minute. Woohoo!